Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Keith Tebow. I am pleased and honored to be chair of the Board of Directors of the Alliance for Community Media, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 2018 Alliance for Community Media National Conference here in Baltimore. Welcome to you all. I appreciate your attendance. We have a lot that's going to be going on over the next few days. We invite you to partake in everything that's happening. One thing I'd like to do before we get started is I'd like those of you who are first-time attendees to either stand or raise your hand. I know there's a table here. Please, just stand for a moment. Give them a round of applause. First-time attendees at our conference. There are many of us who've been to more than one of these, and I appreciate your support as well, so thank you all for coming. As I said, there's a lot to do over the next few days, so feel free to reach out to any board member or any staff member as we go along throughout the next couple of days. Again, we're here to serve you as our members and our attendees to this conference. I'd like to kick off our opening keynote event by thanking first and foremost our sponsor for today, Cablecast Community Media by Tightrope Media Systems. Thank you. Thank them for their support. And of course, a conference like this cannot be done without a lot of work by a lot of people. I would like to welcome and thank our local programming committee on the ground here, led by Lonnie Moffitt. I believe Lonnie's right here. Lonnie, thank you. One of our committee co-chairs for the conference. And Donna Keating, who unfortunately could not be with us today, but she was also very instrumental. Let's give Donna a round of applause. And of course, our Alliance for Community Media staff, led by our President and CEO, Mike Wassenaar, and Melissa Place, our COO, Katie Benson, our conference coordinator, all working hard for you before and during and even after this conference. So without further ado, I'd like to call up right now our President and CEO of the Alliance for Community Media, Mike Wassenaar, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's great to be with you, and I have to tell you, after a bit of a health scare that I had recently, it's great to be anywhere, but especially it's great to be here in Baltimore with everyone here at ACM. So thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm hoping you make the most out of your time here in Baltimore and that this conference helps your practice grow in your community. It helps your organization increase its importance in your town and in your locality. That's really the key message that we're trying to convey through a lot of the work over the course of the next couple of days as we're doing networking and education events here at ACM. We're trying to basically ask you to show a little tirelessness, a little fearlessness in your work so that we can all be more, have more meaning for our communities that here in 2018 need us so much. And I have to emphasize again the fact that you need to actually show some indefatigability, if I get that right. You have to demonstrate some tirelessness. You have to demonstrate some courage to be able to do that here in 2018. We face many challenges. I don't really need to tell you that. I hear that from all of our members and non-members that I talk to on a daily basis across the country. We have changing audiences. We have a fracturing media landscape. We have increased media consolidation that comes with less and less local and less useful content for our communities. More channels, but less meaning. That seems to be the equation for media in 2018. Our communities face a disappearing landscape of local civic information. It's actually forming a crisis in many of our communities that I'm asking all of you to consider stepping up to meet. We're actually seeing that on a daily basis as the newspapers fold and shrink under consolidation. We see that with radio consolidation. We see that with other forms of media consolidation. And you know that. I hear that from you as you tell me about what's happening on Main Street in your communities across the country. People need vital information. And frankly, who, if not us, is there to step up? As I'm here with you today to introduce our keynote speaker, I'm reminded of the last time I talked a little bit about this, and it was when I was receiving the Buskey Leadership Award when I was a volunteer with this organization. And it came on the heels of state franchising and local budget crises that occurred after the 2008 Wall Street crash. I looked around the room in Chicago that day, looking for colleagues who were no longer in the room, for community media centers that had disappeared and winked out of existence, even though the community still needed them, and still need them today. The plain matter that I want to put to all of you is that while we have 500 members around the country, and we're represented in some 42 states of the Union, from Kennebunkport to Kauai, from Maine to Maui, and maybe there's perhaps another 3,000 PEG channels, and I don't know how many community radio stations there are. There's got to be at least 2,000 community radio stations, maybe. I don't know. I'll have to talk to Sabrina about this over drinks later on. It's not enough for our communities as they're facing what I would call an information crisis in 2018. There are vast swaths of the national map where there's no substantial community or civic media. There's even no local government meeting coverage so that citizens can hold their governments accountable. And actually, that's the place where government fulfills its obligation to citizens in our democracy by actually demonstrating how democracy works. When we overlaid this with the rapidly disappearing journalistic space, you see something frightening that enables political conditions that are really detrimental to our society. We see a withering of our democracy and a slow starvation of civic good that we have to battle. To fight that, it can be overwhelming. It can seem like a mountain of work. You have to be tireless and you have to be fearless. You have to advocate and you have to innovate. And when I think of those qualities, I think about today's keynote speaker, Amy Goodman. I first met Amy some 20 years ago when I was the program director at KFAI in Minneapolis. Amy would generously do fundraising pitches for community stations around the country to build their capacity for our grassroots work. And these were organizations that ran Democracy Now! At the time in the late 90s. And she really did so tirelessly, so much so that I can remember at least one radio conference in Maryland 20 years ago where we sat on the edge of a bed with a DAT recorder. And over the course of 2 hours, we recorded a series of, I think, probably something like 2 hours of fundraising pitches that we used at KFAI later on, that I used for our fundraisers. I mean, it was kind of crazy because we'd be passing the microphone backwards and forwards at this, Stark Marriott in Bethesda, Maryland. And the words, "That's right, Amy. You can make a pledge by calling right now." Are kind of burned in my head because we've been doing this sort of thing over and over and again for about 2 hours. But it worked a great deal. It raised the capacity of our organization. It made our organization better. It helped me in terms of my leadership capacity. And I can really thank her because of the tirelessness that she's shown in that work. You fast forward another 10 years to 2008. It's a very, very different circumstance where we worked together. I was the executive director at St. Paul Neighborhood Network. And the folks at SPNN got to witness Amy and her crew as they were covering the Republican National Convention in 2008. They actually did their productions at the SPNN studios. We actually found them some co-located space for the reporters and journalists that they worked with over the course of the week at the RNC. And I was able to give them an internet connection that we kind of wangled through the false ceiling at our studios. And I was also able to sweet talk the government representatives at Comcast to give us a series of DVRs that Amy's crew then used to be able to do media coverage for Democracy Now! I don't think Comcast ever got the credit during the course of the RNC coverage. So thank you, Comcast. That said, I mean, it was an amazing, amazing week at the RNC. But I have to also tell you that it's really kind of hard to describe the militaristic atmosphere that reporters and protesters at the convention faced during the course of that week. It was really sort of unprecedented in our community in St. Paul. I think in the 2004 Republican National Convention, we saw that kind of militaristic presence. We didn't know that existed in our community until the RNC came. And we saw that Amy and her staff had to fight off arrests to cover free speech in the community and free speech on the streets of St. Paul. during the course of that week. They did their work fearlessly in 2008, something that I still find that's inspiring, as fear and intimidation were the tools used to silence dissent in our community in the Midwest. Now, Amy joins us here at our conference at a time when we have to be fearless and tireless ourselves, because media is more and more controlled in places that don't serve community needs or are simply uninterested in the vast diversity that represents our nation. All the places, think of all the places that are not served because of information deserts that have arisen in the last 10 years. All the people who do not see their lives represented in our media system on a daily basis. All the folk who don't see anyone who looks like them. It's up to us to grow media that matters in our communities, and we need to be stepping up. No one else will do it but ourselves. No one else will form alliances with other communities. No one else will build that power to be able to make sure that our nation can fulfill its promise. So who better to join us to kick off our conference in Be More, asking us to consider the importance and urgency of our work to be more and to mean more in the lives of our communities. Please welcome to the stage Amy Goodman.
Those lights are bright. My goodness. Well, when I came in today, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if someone was being attacked or what. People were shouting in the lobby. It was the game. And yes, Croatia just won, beating out England. That will affect our broadcast tomorrow. I'm very concerned when these global events affect the technicians and the places we broadcast, because, of course, tomorrow is when President Trump goes to Britain, and it's very hard for us to reach any technician in any TV studio to have our guest on tomorrow, because they're all watching, and now they'll all be, to say the least, very depressed. But just as I was walking up on the stage, I got a horrible picture. I don't know if you can see it. But it's a picture of a woman with her nose bleeding, just blood dripping down her face. And it says, an uncomfortable football and British truth. Domestic violence and the World Cup are closely linked, with reported incidents up by 26% if England plays, 38% if England loses, and 11% the next day, win or lose. You know, it's our job in community media. It's our job in all the media, as people celebrate, as people, talk about the game as a game, to talk about the very painful truths that we all must deal with all over the world. The headline on this story, if England gets beaten, so will she. I want to applaud all of you for being here, how important this organization is, and Mike at the helm, how important public access TV, PEG stations are all over the country, giving a sense of place, because all global issues really start locally, and the power is in the grassroots voices in everyone's community who are involved, and hearing those voices rather than the pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong that we see every single day on the networks. This place, Baltimore, your theme, Be More, I hope before you leave you get to go to the Frederick Douglass Museum. Yes, Frederick Douglass. This was where he stayed and lived and took shelter. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. And it might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. And so when he grew up, when he was a teenager, he was given to a man known as a slave breaker, Ed Covey, brought to his plantation called Mount Misery. And he was beaten and tortured, but he fought back and he broke away and he went north. And in 1852, Frederick Douglass, who became the leading abolitionist in this country, speaking about something he knew well, having been enslaved himself, was invited to Rochester, New York, to speak before the Women's Anti-Slavery Society. And I don't know how many of you run Democracy Now! On your local stations. Could I see a show of hands? That's beautiful. And I also want to let you know that everyone can. You can run Democracy Now!, our daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour. You can get it from C-band, from satellite, from the internet, from free speech TV as well. You can get it. We have these a robust server for you can just download the show any which way. We always help stations make it available to you, and I see many friends in the room representing stations all over. Democracy Now! Began 22 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting on 9 community radio stations in 1996. We're going to pack up the day after that election took place. It was the second election of Bill Clinton, but there was more demand for the show after the election than before because we used the election as a way to go from state to state, use the primary system to find out what people were doing in their communities. Most people didn't vote, but I never thought it was because of apathy. I thought, well, what are people doing in their communities? And that's what we were giving voice to. And so the show grew and on radio stations around the country. Then September 11th, 2001, that week, just by chance, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, public access TV in New York, and I hear Tony Riddle rode his bicycle here. Absolutely amazing. Well, he was in charge at the time. And they asked if Democracy Now! Would begin. We were supposed to, slated to run coincidentally that week, but as emergency broadcasts, we started on MNN, and that's started Democracy Now! On television all over the country. As soon as we went on, at the time it was a televised radio show, now it's completely a TV show and a radio show simultaneously. Public access stations around the country asked if they could run Democracy Now! And at the time on video cassette, the FedEx guys would come, they looked like Santa Claus by the end, dragging garbage bags filled with video cassettes. I felt it was critical to get it to stations the next day because it was breaking news. Now, of course, we do it through satellite and through the internet. And that was in 2001. And then NPR stations would ask if they could run Democracy Now! PBS stations would ask if they could run Democracy Now! And now we're broadcasting on 1,400 public television and radio stations around the country and around the world. And any of you are welcome to pick up the show every day. It really builds audience. I come out to stations to do fundraisers all the time. It's the lifeblood of Democracy Now! Is also shoring up independent media. You could write to Angie at democracynow.org, ANGIE, who has been with us almost since the beginning. Also, by the way, you can sign up for our daily news headlines by sending the word Democracy Now!, one word, no space, to the number 66866. Democracy Now! To 66866 for your own edification, keeping up on news, media alerts. We're also sending around a daily digest on clipboards, and you can sign up there. But it is such a privilege to be with all of you. But as I think about Frederick Douglass giving that speech, those of you who run Democracy Now! Know that on July 4th, every July 4th, we play Frederick Douglass's speech, read by James Earl Jones. And we think about what he says and how it resonates today. Frederick Douglass looked out on the audience in Rochester and said, "Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting for your independence to us? I'm not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today, he said. He went on, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants' brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour, he said in 1852. And in ending, he said, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour forth a stream, a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced, he said. Yes, that was Frederick Douglass's speech in 1852. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? And so sadly today, well over 150 years later, does it raise questions for a number of populations today, particularly on the border and what's taking place there, and how important it is that we hear all voices. You know, Democracy Now! Was just in Brownsville, Texas, broadcasting from one of the largest protests they ever had. It's got a sister city right over the border, right? Matamoros. McAllen, right over the border is Reynosa. I mean, these are like 5 minutes away if you're an American citizen. You walk over the bridge and you just come right back. You just put a quarter into the turnstile when you walk. But it's certainly not so simple for people coming back. This 4th of July, what happened in New York, the city of the Statue of Liberty, a group called Rise and Resist protested on Liberty Island. They closed the entire island, keeping 3,000 people away, the people who had come, the visitors, the tourists, shipping them off the island and keeping others away, when a young woman named Therese Patricia Okomo, an American citizen, originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, broke away from the Rise and Resist group. Unbeknownst to them, she started to climb the Statue of Liberty. And she quoted the First Lady that she so admired, Michelle Obama. And she said, "I was inspired by the First Lady's words, 'When they go low, we go high.' I went as high as I could," she said. But the horror of what's taking place, the separated children. Yesterday was the deadline for the U.S. government to release 100 children of, they call it tender age, children under 5, who were snatched from their parents as they came over the border and jailed as their parents were. About 100 of them. A federal judge in San Diego, Judge Sabra, who is Japanese American. You may remember what happened in World War II, 110,000 people of Japanese or Japanese American descent put into internment camps. He ruled that the government must release all the children it has taken by July 26th. It's in 2 weeks. Yesterday, all the children under 5. He said, "These are not aspirational goals that I am setting. This is a deadline." Well, the U.S. government did not meet that deadline. And the amazing moment on TV yesterday when the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, was asked, "Where are the children? Where have you put them? What about the parents?" And he said about the taking of children that has united people across the political spectrum. Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green, every ethnicity, race, gender. People horrified from here in the United States to the Pope at the Vatican. Alex Azar responded yesterday saying, "It is one of the great acts of American generosity and charity, what we are doing for these unaccompanied kids who are smuggled into our country or come across illegally, to take them." They have admitted that they deported 20% of their parents. They say they released 38 children. The ACLU, which brought the original lawsuit, said, "We want to see evidence of this," as they talk about doing a favor to these children, who he said were brought over by rapists and murderers and child molesters. Of course, that followed up on President Trump. You remember when he first announced for president years ago, coming down in the escalator in Trump Palace or Trump Tower, running on the backs of Mexicans, talking about Mexican rapists. He's now advanced his language to talk about the immigrants who infest this country. Infest this country. You think about what this country was built on. Unless you were Native American, how did you come here? Infest this country, he said. I didn't think I would be giving a speech quoting the neoconservative Bill Kristol. When Bill Kristol heard Trump's comments about the immigrants who infest this country, he said, "It must make more sense in the original German." The horror of what has taken place. 3,000 children up to the age of 18 taken. So we went down to Brownsville to investigate, the Democracy Now! Team. And you saw this across your TV screens if you run Democracy Now! We talked to the people there. Now, when we took our plane down to Brownsville, you know, you hate to be caught at the gate with your little rollie and they say, "Nope, it's not going to fit in the overhead." And they take it at the gate. But you know what happens when they take it? No matter how annoyed we are, they give you a receipt. Tag, so you can get it back at the other end. They didn't even dignify immigrants who are fleeing horrors in their own country, like Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador, by giving them a receipt for their children. There wasn't even that. Some of these parents were told their children were being taken so that they could be bathed. Not even a receipt. It is so clear at this point that the Trump administration never planned to give back these children to their parents. That's why there was no system set up. To the horror of so many. And you know, I always say never assume that based on a person's position, what their position will be. I mean, Democracy Now!, we spoke to a whistleblower. He worked in one of these jails, one of these shelters. It's hard to call it a shelter when kids are put in cages and given Mylar blankets. That's it, just like aluminum foil. And he had been working at this shelter teaching capoeira. He didn't know all these children would then be dumped there and caged there. And he is Brazilian. He spoke Portuguese. And suddenly he's being asked to work all the time because the kids are just flooding in. And he sees these brothers and sisters, 3 of them from Brazil, so they only spoke Portuguese. A 16-year-old boy, his 10-year-old brother, and his 8-year-old sister. And they were huddled together. They were wailing. And he went over, he said, "What's the matter?" in Portuguese. And they said, "My parents have been killed." They said, "Your parents have been killed?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, what makes you think that?" And they used the term, they said they were told they were lost, and they interpreted that as killed. And he said, no, they really are lost. They're not killed. And so the 16-year-old was holding his 8-year-old sister, and they were hugging each other, and a supervisor came over and said, "Tell that boy to stop hugging his sister." And Antar said, "That's it. You tell the boy to stop hugging his sister." Already ripped away from their parents, and he's supposed to tell them to separate. He said the cruelty was just unbearable. So we went into Brownsville, and right before the mass protest of about 1,000 people in front of the federal courthouse, where immigrants were brought in, scores of them at a time, and they had their children taken away, there was this mass protest. All sorts of groups were there, and I hope these are groups that populate your studios, people feeling that they have a community organization where they can do programming. That is the beauty and the power of community media. Many people spoke. I interviewed a woman named Juanita Valdez-Cox, and she runs a group called Lupe, and they are farm workers who are, all the different nonprofits are now working to reunite the children with their parents, helping somehow, some way to do this. And she talked about an 8 and 10-year-old brother who had been deported themselves, sent across the border into Reynosa, notorious gang activity, violent town across from McAllen. Their parents couldn't find them anywhere. They roamed the streets, children deported. And then today we brought you a story from Loimi, from a Houston Chronicle reporter, Loimi Creel, who had just been in a Brownsville courtroom last week, where a Salvadoran woman was brought forward, weeping. Her children taken away from her. She had 4 children. She was fleeing. She had been raped by 2 police officers. She came into the United States. She was appealing for political asylum. It's what we represent. It's absolutely legal. She had 4 children. The youngest one was breastfeeding, and they took them all away. And to this day, Loimi doesn't think that they have been reunited. And so we went to investigate, and we brought all the TV audiences with us by bringing our cameras, the amazing Democracy Now! Team. And we went over the border. We walked from Brownsville to Matamoros and back. For us, it was easy. And you know, President Trump has said, why can't they do it legally? Why can't they come over the legal ports of entry? That does resonate with many people. If you want to do it, you have to do it according to law and order. And so we came back over the border into the United States, and there the people are lined up, like the Guatemalan mother, 21 years old, with her 2-year-old daughter. She'd been waiting for 4 days over the new bridge and the old bridge going into the United States. She was doing it legally, just like they told her. It was over 100 degrees. And she was told America was full. This is against the law. This is against the law. So they say do it legally. People are so desperate, they go to the legal places and they are turned back. So they end up in desperation turning to the coyotes. And the only way they will do this is if they face worse violence at home. They can drown going over the Rio Grande. Who knows what violence they face? And it's important to hear their stories, is what Democracy Now! Does. Bringing you the stories, telling the stories of people who can't tell their own when they can't. But most importantly, providing a forum for people to speak for themselves. And what does that do? What do all of your stations do? I mean, the power of hearing someone speak. It reminds me of, well, we originally started on 5 stations on the Pacifica Radio Network, you know, which was founded back in 1949 in Berkeley, California. KPFA, the first station in 1949 after World War II. A man named Lou Hill, who was a war resistor, a conscientious objector, came out of the detention camps and said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. So Pacifica was born. KPFA, the first station. Or as George Gerbner said, late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And so KPFA was born in Berkeley, 49, KPFK in Los Angeles, 59, 1960, my station in New York, WBAI, and WPFW in Washington, D.C., 1977, KPFT in Houston, 1970. KPFT in Houston, which is just down the road from Houston Media Source, another public access TV station that runs Democracy Now! KPFT in Houston is the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. It went on the air in 1970 in the spring, and a few weeks later, the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. Right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought was a good song. But they got back on their feet, they rebuilt the transmitter, they went back on the air, and the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up again. Then it took many months, but then all the networks came to cover this phoenix that had risen from the ashes, and in January of 1971, almost 48 years ago, Arlo Guthrie came back into Houston to finish his song live on the air, and KPFT went back on. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. Why? Because I think he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, like the Guatemalan mother holding her 2-year-old baby, or an aunt in Iraq, a child in Yemen whose family blown up in perhaps a U.S. drone strike, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it changes you. I mean, you might say, it sounds like my aunt, it sounds like my uncle, oh my God, it sounds like my cousin, and I can't stand him. But you begin to understand where they're coming from. It makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy that person, right? That understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back, which is what I think all of you are doing here, and why I think what you engage in your communities is such a noble act to open up your stations to the community so people can speak to each other who normally perhaps wouldn't know each other. But when you watch that TV screen, you see a person you didn't know, but you come to understand where they're coming from. That's the power of independent media. So back to Brownsville, where we were. We brought our viewers on that journey and our listeners to Brownsville, to Matamoros, and back. And then on Friday afternoon, 2 weeks ago, we went over to the old Walmart in Brownsville. Oh, the police came over really quickly, the sheriff's deputies. They said, you don't come on this property. It's an old Walmart where 1,400 children are caged inside. Do you remember when Senator Merkley from Oregon went to this Walmart a few weeks ago? They almost arrested him. He said, I just want to speak to someone. I understand children are caged inside. So we went over to investigate. Everywhere it says private property, you can't go near the building. The very few windows that there are blacked out. This old Walmart. Sheriff's deputies lined up. No, one more step, and we're going to arrest you, they told us. And I said to the sheriff's deputy, what happens if you got a call right now? And someone said to you that there are 1,400 children that are caged inside. Wouldn't you go? And wouldn't you think it's also my job as a journalist, if I got a tip that 1,400 children were caged right behind you, that I should go investigate? And he said very quietly, you're preaching to the choir. Please, please leave. It is our job to go to where the silence is. So we went from Southwest Key over to the Brownsville airport because we had to leave then. Usually you're going through airports to get to the places that you need to cover. Who knew the airports were the places we needed to cover? So we get in there with the last ones to get the last 6 seats on the American Airlines plane out that Friday afternoon. And we go in, we get our tickets, and we have time at the airport. There's 2 airlines there, American and United. United is refusing to take separated children anywhere. They won't fly them, they say. I wanted to see if I could find the quote of the CEO named Munoz. You may remember who he is, but they said, we will not engage in this. We will not fly separated children. American does. I went to talk to the American Airlines folks. They said, we really can't talk. We can't talk about politics here. And we went over to the cafe to get a taco as we were waiting. And a very nervous young man who was serving people there, I asked him, have you seen any separated children? He said, yes, of course. I said, would you mind if we filmed you? Our cameras were out on the table. And he said, no, not at all. I want to talk about it. And he sat down and he looked into the camera. And he said, it started a few months before. He said, a whole bunch of children would come in. And the men would come over to the cafe and he would serve them breakfast. And he would say, aren't you with those children? And they would say, yes. He said, should I bring the children breakfast? He said, they're always brought in early in the morning. And they said, no, they can't have breakfast. And at first he thought they were classes of kids. He did notice they were wearing the same thing. And then he understood as he followed the news, these are the separated children. And they were flying them through the airport. And I asked him, what did they look like? He said, well, when they were brothers and sisters, they'd be hugging each other. And they would wear sweatshirts and sweatpants, and they had little bags with them. And so then we went over, through TSA to go to our gate. And quietly, one of the TSA agents said to us, they could see that we were reporters, 2 UMs over there, 2 UMs over there. UMs? Unaccompanied minors. And then we saw 2 young men with black sweatshirts, brand new. That's the telltale sign. And they've got a minder with them, a woman. And one of my colleagues, Laura Gottesdiener, producer at Democracy Now!, as he went into the bathroom, one of the kids, she walked up to him. She speaks Spanish, and she said to him quickly, "Where are you headed?" He said, "To Florida." He said he was at Southwest Key for the last 3, that's the old Walmart, for the last 3 months. Many, many children were being brought in there. And we asked the minder if we could continue to talk to them. She said, "Get away." She was angry. She said she worked for Southwest Key. We all got on the flight, and we flew to Dallas. And then we went over to gate, what was it, B13, where we were going to get our flight to Newark. And everyone was wasted 2 days of no sleep, producing all night for the show in the morning. And everyone was sort of sprawled out on a set of chairs that were facing each other. And I got some tickets, and I came over, and I saw our crew. And then right next to them, all these children. Oh, they look 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. An older gentleman who looked like Santa Claus speaking to them quickly in Spanish, and a younger woman speaking to them. And I looked down, their shoes, all the same, brand new slip-on sneakers. They were getting smarter now. They weren't all wearing the exact same thing. Laura got up, and she went over to the sign to look at the Newark sign. She said to the oldest girl, "Where are you headed?" She said, I don't know. Immediately, the man jumped up. He was wearing ID. He said, "Get away from those children. I'm a social worker. You're to get away from them now." And she said, "Well, can you tell me where you're taking them?" And he said, "I can't tell you. It's the situation. It's the situation." It's all happening in plain sight. You know that thousands of children were taken and dispersed to at least 17 states. In New York, a couple hundred children were taken, 300 some odd children. The governor and the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, did not know they were being brought in. One Congress member, a woman from Westchester, Kathleen Rice, was interviewed, and she said she was flying home from Washington. She wanted to check out one of the facilities. She hadn't even been told that in her district kids were being brought. And she said, "I don't think most of these children will ever see their parents again." It is so important that we tell this story, and that when possible, the people involved in these stories tell their stories themselves. People want to talk, like the waiter. I asked him, "Why are you speaking? You could lose your job." He said, "I have twin brother and sister. They're 13 years old." And he said, "That's all I could think of when I see these kids every week. Why do they bring them so early in the morning?" he said. The dignity it gives to someone to describe their experience, to say something about something they feel that is wrong. That's the power of what all of you do, is you provide that forum, and that increases the conversation that we all have to have. Everyone in every walk of life is involved. We had on a woman named Dana Sinopoli. She's a psychologist in Philadelphia. She was so moved by what she saw that she wrote a letter. It was now been signed by well over 13,000 mental health professionals. Hundreds of mental health organizations have signed on. In this letter, she said, to try and argue that this policy of ripping children from their parents at the border is somehow different from the systematic traumatization of children during the times of slavery, forced assimilation, and the Holocaust is to disregard history. To somehow convince ourselves that this systematic traumatization of children has no bearing on the lives of these children and no impact on the legacy of our country is to be living in an alternate universe. And to not care about the impact these policies have on these children is to succumb to the worst potential of humanity. just posted it, and thousands and thousands of mental health professionals signed on. And in the midst of all of this, we invited Michael Bennett on. You know who Michael Bennett is? Yeah, the star NFL player, the Seattle Seahawk, who just left the Seattle Seahawks and is now going to be an Eagle in Philadelphia. And you all know right by Philadelphia how important the Eagles are to Philadelphia. So they won the Super Bowl this year, and President Trump disinvited them from the White House and continues to go after these football players who take a stand by taking a knee. The NFL owners, I think it's appropriate, they're called owners, right? The majority, billionaires, overwhelmingly white men, made a decision recently that teams where players kneel will be fined. They can stay in the locker room, but they can't kneel on the field. And I thought about Michael Bennett at that time. Michael Bennett, who Time magazine had Michael Bennett, Colin Kaepernick, and Dr. Martin Luther King in the middle, all kneeling. So the Seattle Seahawks, I think, are the kneelingest football team. And the Philadelphia Eagles, no one has kneeled, but they are politically active. That's who he's joining. Michael was hardly on any national broadcast, but he came on Democracy Now! His book just came out, Things That Make White People Uncomfortable. And he sat in the studio with me and Juan Gonzalez, the great journalist who co-hosts Democracy Now! With me. And he talked about things that make white people uncomfortable. He's joining some powerful players, like Malcolm Jenkins. Malcolm Jenkins didn't kneel. He put up his fist. He responded to Trump's disinvitation with silence. Well, not exactly silence, but he held up a series of handwritten signs, and if you go to Democracy Now!, you'll see what he did, before members of the press. Some of them read, "You aren't listening." And then the press kept asking questions, and he put up another sign. "More than 60% of people in prison are people of color." And then he put up another sign. "Any given night, 500,000 sit in jail. Convicted? No. Too poor? Yes. Hashtag end cash bail." He put up another one. "Colin Kaepernick gave $1 million to charity." And another one. "In 2018, 439 people shot and killed by police thus far." I think the number is maybe over 500 at this point this year. And you know, when the NFL owners made this decision to fine the players for kneeling from this time forward, just a few hours after they handed down their edict, a 17-year-old boy, a teenager, was gunned down in Pittsburgh. A 17-year-old teenager named Antoine Rose, gunned down by a police officer who was sworn in a few hours before. An eyewitness said it looked like the officer was taking target practice on Antoine's back. He was running away from a car he was in after the officer made a traffic stop with the car, shot in the back. These are the stories we have to tell. These are the stories that are affecting every community. And people are organizing all over the country. That resistance is the hope, and I really see media as that oasis of dissent that will save us. You know, as late as this past week, President Trump has called the media the enemy of the people, which puts a target on media workers all over this country. When the 5 media workers were just gunned down in Annapolis, reporters asked President Trump as he walked across the lawn, did he have something to say? He could have said something as simple, our hearts are with the families of the gunned down journalists. He wouldn't even say that. He's extremely serious, and this attack on the media has changed the corporate media as well. I mean, a lot of times they sound like Democracy Now! Right? You hear them saying the media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. And it is, and it's so important they take that stand. Yes, the check and balance on power must be allowed to engage in the practice we do, providing that forum for people to tell their stories. And before I go, I wanted to tell one other story about what's taken place in the last year. It was in 2016, so it was a little more than a year ago. But how many of you know about the standoff at Standing Rock? Probably many of you. But what a privilege it was to be able to go to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, to see this epic struggle play out, and to be able to broadcast it all over this country and around the world. We went to Standing Rock, my colleagues Dennis Moynihan, Laura Gottesdiener, and John Hamilton. We went there on Labor Day weekend of 2016. It was at the height of the presidential election. We were late to it. I mean, we were reporting on it before, but not there on the ground. April 1st, 2016, LaDonna Brave Ballard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, opened up her property along the Cannonball River to the resistance. What was the resistance? Well, she was saying anyone who would come and resist the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline, she said, was welcome on her property. So people started to come, pitch teepees and tents on her property. She thought a couple dozen people would come and she would host them. It went from dozens to scores of people to hundreds to thousands of people. Resistance camps were set up all over the area. It was the largest unification of Native American tribes and First Nations from Canada and Latin America that this country has seen in decades. It was astounding, the response. And they were responding to what they called the Black Snake, DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that would be dug under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, and they were concerned that it would pollute the water downstream of something like 17 million people. Not just Native American, everyone. They didn't call themselves protesters, they called themselves water protectors. And they gathered, and they spoke out. And they weren't different from most other North Dakotans. You know, the people of Bismarck, the capital, they didn't want the Dakota Access Pipeline there, and so it wasn't built there. The people of Mandan, where the courthouse and the prison is in North Dakota, they didn't want it, wasn't built there. The Native Americans weren't so lucky. And so we went there that Labor Day weekend to film, to see what was happening, and the protests were remarkable. They'd start with a water ceremony on these back rural roads of North Dakota. Older women in traditional garb, Native American garb, kids, men. They would start with this water ceremony, and they would hold up a glass of water, and they would be confronted by a fully militarized sheriff's department. Their neighbors. And they would say, this water is for you, not just for us. It's for your children, not just for ours. And you know that scene of a militarized police department. Mike described it in St. Paul during the conventions. You all know it from Ferguson, Missouri. The corporate media did go there, and that was very important. When corporate media journalists are tear gassed, they let you know about it. And that was horrific. You remember, it was 2015. Michael Brown, the teenage boy just graduated from high school, going on to college. It was August 9th, 2015. Gunned down by a white police officer, laying in the hot, baking August sun, hour after hour, his corpse. The whole community rose up, and they were met by this fully militarized, police departments of suburban St. Louis. It is amazing what's happening in this country. Some of the most eloquent people to speak out against this militarization are former police chiefs, and sometimes current police chiefs, but people like Norm Stamper. And we started broadcasting Democracy Now! On television intermittently way back in 1999 at the Battle of Seattle. You may remember it, protests against the World Trade Organization. Norm Stamper was the police chief in charge. He met the protesters with so much tear gas, they had to fly out to other states to get more. It was a virtual police riot. It was astounding. You had thousands of people protesting, teachers, librarians, high school kids, environmentalists, labor activists, union leaders, doctors, nurses, farmers were rising up. And the police department just cracked down, arresting, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And after this happened, Norm Stamper was driven out, as he should have been. He would later say it was the worst mistake of his life. And he said, how do you think we viewed the people through the weapons that we had? He said, when you're looking through the crosshairs of a gun, you see them as the enemy. And he said, that's what happened to us. I forgot, he said, that they were our kids, our librarians, our teachers, our doctors, and our nurses. And he now eloquently speaks out against the militarization of police. But that's what we saw on the back roads of North Dakota. And we filmed this, and then it was Saturday of that Labor Day weekend. We followed a group of people who were planting their native flags in an area that they called their tribal burial ground. So we were filming, and then we saw the bulldozers. They did not expect on this holiday weekend that the DAPL bulldozers would be operating, but there they were, and they were digging up, excavating the property. This was the contested property. A judge was going to rule a few days later. And he had asked the tribe, if you say this is your sacred burial ground, prove it to me. Give me a map. And they did. And then the judge, as judges do, had to give it to the other side. And the people felt that the other side took it. And even though the bulldozers had been way down the road, they felt they leapfrogged them up to this site, specifically because they'd mapped it out so that they would change the facts on the ground before the judge ruled, and this just infuriated them. And so the people came, little girls, women, they came onto the property, and they stood in front of the bulldozers, and they said no. They said back up. And it was terrifying, because these are vast, earth-crushing machines. How dangerous this was. But the people just kept walking forward. And the bulldozers did pull back, one after another, and we're just filming this. And the bulldozers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are moving back, and the people are moving forward. And at the resistance camps, they heard about what's happening, and they came forward. There were hundreds of people. The bulldozers pulled back, and it was then that the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed attack dogs on the Native Americans. We just kept our cameras rolling. It was horrifying. And the dogs would bite the Native Americans. In fact, the guards would throw them into the crowd. I am a dog lover, so this was horrifying to see. But when the dogs would be thrown into the crowd, they would have to bite their way out. They were scared too, but they were trained as attack dogs. Maybe I just anthropomorphized them and said they were scared. And they bit. And the people were bitten, they were bruised, they were bleeding. We filmed a dog with his nose and mouth dripping with blood, with human blood. And then the people kept on walking forward. The guards finally took their dogs, went into their pickup trucks and their cars, and the bulldozers pulled back, and the people prevailed. Bitten, beaten, maced, ridiculously high price, but they prevailed on that day. We took that film. Oh, we had interviewed people like Winona LaDuke of the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, right? She said, Governor Dalrymple, the governor at the time of North Dakota, you are not George Wallace. This is not 1965 Alabama. We are through. And we took this video and we posted it online, and we flew back to New York. Within 48 hours, there were 14 million views of this video. You know, I'm sometimes invited onto CNN and MSNBC to talk about various issues, and I talk to the hosts, and they say that the executives say you can't talk about climate change, right? That it's going to make people's eyes glaze over. I think this showed the lie. People care. You know, what were the Native Americans fighting for? Sustainability of the planet. Talking about how we will, if we don't fight this together, we will all go down. 14 million views. Any corporate executive of a network would drool to get that number in that brief amount of time. And so we came back to New York. We continued to cover the issue. And the judge was going to rule on Friday. On Thursday, the governor called out the National Guard. It did not look good for the tribe. Oh, and then the authorities also issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know it at the time. The next day, Friday, we did our show, and Nermeen Sheikh and I went up to the Toronto International Film Festival. We were invited there because there was a new film out on the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And it talked about his history. You know, he was the one who said, teaching young journalism students, if you can remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And so it was a film, and that's the name of the film, All Governments Lie. And it talked about the news organizations that are following in I.F. Stone's footsteps, like Democracy Now!, so they asked us to come up. So we weren't going to we weren't fleeing. We really were invited to speak that day. And I spoke after the film. I thought it was important to go to, because people in Canada care about First Nations. We just left North Dakota to share our eyewitness accounts. The next day I was at the University of Toronto, and about this number of people were there and giving a talk about what had happened. And I see on my phone, it says, you're under arrest. And I had no idea what was going on. I hadn't heard about any arrest warrant. And I thought, is this some kind of, did someone in the audience, is this like some scam? Is this a way to say, wrap up? I have no idea. And don't worry, I will in a few minutes. And then I saw it was a North Dakota number. And I knew it wasn't a joke. And it's not as if there's a arrest warrant for you, you immediately get arrested. I mean, but if you have interaction with FBI police or border guards and there's an arrest warrant for you, you will be taken. And I was in Canada, and I had to go over the border. So I thought I might not say something at this moment. So I just said, could someone call me a cab? And I raced to the airport. I thought, if I can get home before the arrest warrant goes into the system, if in fact this is true, and I did get home, and it was true. I didn't take it personally. I really thought the authorities were sending a message to all reporters, do not go to North Dakota, which is exactly why we had to go. And I also wanted to send a message to young reporters. This epic struggle, if you feel you're going to be arrested, you don't have the resources or the institutional backing to end up in jail, that you have to call the bluff of the authorities at a time like this, than when they want to stop the coverage of these kind of historic moments. So we went back to North Dakota a few weeks later, and as we flew into Bismarck, I got word the authorities were dropping the arrest, quashing the arrest warrant. Oh, except they would bring more serious charges against me. Riot? Riot? We were just filming, like I'm a one-woman riot? And so I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, what does this mean? What do I face? And he said, it's not the worst thing in the world, maybe a year in jail. A year in jail? So this was a Friday. I said, well, what's the next step? And he said, you'll be arraigned on Monday at 1:30, which gave us 2.5 days to cover the protest. That was good. But we put out a press release. I asked, is this automatic? He said, absolutely. I said, what's the judge's name? He said, no, this is rubber stamp. They use their discretion after, not at this time. They'll rubber stamp for the arraignment. I said, no, when I hear the word judge, I think discretion. That judge can decide whether or not to even have me arraigned. So we put out a press release. We named the judge, said he would be deciding. All the media started to pay attention. And on Monday morning, the show must go on, 7 o'clock North Dakota time. Dennis Moynihan called a truck from Minneapolis, a satellite truck. We broadcast from across from the prison and the courthouse, so I could turn myself in right after. And we interviewed the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, Dave Archambault. I said, have you ever been arrested? And he said, yes, for civil disobedience just months ago. I said, what happened? He said, I was strip searched, put in an orange jumpsuit, and jailed for a misdemeanor charge for civil disobedience. Interviewed the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux, Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle. She cared about the health of the kids. She was one of the first to be arrested, saying, no, this endangers the health of all of our communities. I said, well, what happened? Minor misdemeanor. And she said, I was strip searched. I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can a people take? So we broadcast the show that day. And as the hours went by and I had to turn myself in, more and more people came to show solidarity. All the media was covering this. It was the homepage of BBC, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera. Vogue magazine was covering this. And right before 1:30, I got a call from North Dakota Public Radio. Got host who'd been there forever. It's not a big state. Knows all the players, said the judge is not going to sign off on these charges. So I wouldn't be arraigned. And it wasn't just me. Native Americans who faced felony and misdemeanor charges that day, a number of them had those charges dropped. This is what happens when the media shines a spotlight in the right direction. And this is what all of us can do together. This is the kind of reality TV we must all support, showing the reality of people's lives on the ground in your community. Not the kind of reality TV our president stars in, but the reality of all of our lives so that we can talk to each other and help determine the future. I just wanted to end by saying, by going back to World War II, where Pacifica Radio began, but World War II in Germany, World War II to a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And together, Hans was a medical student, Sophie was an undergraduate, and together with their professor and other students, they formed the White Rose Collective, and they thought, well, at least we could get out information. And they published a series of pamphlets, 6 in all, and on one of them were written the words, "We will not be silent." I think of each of these pamphlets as a public access station somewhere in the country. We will not be silent. And they would get these pamphlets out anywhere they could, drop them from a school balcony, from a schoolyard, into an alleyway in the middle of the night, in a courtyard, in a marketplace, in the evening, under cover of darkness. But then they were captured. Hans and Sophie and their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amy Goodman. Please give her a round of applause. Wow. It's kind of hard to follow that. There's this old line in vaudeville, you don't follow children's acts or animal acts. And I think I also don't follow Amy Goodman as the other adage. I want to thank you all for joining us here for our opening address. We'll retreat now for some repast. We'll actually have a reception in our vendor area, so please join us for that. over the course of the next 90 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us here at ACM Bmore. Please enjoy the rest of the evening.